Welcome, everybody. Good Shabbat. Today, we continue our discussion on the book of Ecclesiastes, and this is part 3 of our series. Let's jump right in. Essentially, if you don't know the book of Ecclesiastes, it's from the wisdom tradition, from the Hebrew Bible, from the Hebrew Testament. Today, we continue with Ecclesiastes 1:16 through 18. And these verses talk about the fact that worldly wisdom does not resolve frustration and suffering in life. This is an absolute truth. When you talk about relative truth, there are truths that change and fluctuate and sometimes bring about positive growth and sometimes bring about lesser growth or backsliding in life. But when you talk about absolute reality and the apprehension and understanding of supreme truth, of union with God consciousness, worldly wisdom can never bring us to that state, to that divine state of union with God, with our source. On a relative level, yes, it's possible to get more education, right? To go back to school so that you can get a better paying job, etc. And that may or may not happen in today's world. There are many people with very advanced degrees that do not have well-paying jobs. So there are different kinds of wisdom that we can attain in the world that help us to navigate the world and different problems that we have and frustrations that we may have financially, emotionally, and otherwise. And there is different worldly wisdom that can help us to manage the stress of living in the world, the stress which causes frustration, ill health, and suffering. But ultimately, worldly wisdom cannot give us the highest knowledge, the highest attainment of a certain kind of God consciousness, always being aware of God and knowing that God is aware of us, and this oneness between our divine parent and our soul. So here, the writer of Ecclesiastes writes, I said to myself, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me. And my mind has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my mind to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceived that this also is but a chasing after the wind. For in much wisdom is much vexation, and those who increase knowledge increase sorrow. A lot of people think that wisdom and knowledge is the same thing, and that's just not the case. There's a lot of knowledge in the world. You can pick up a lot of books. You can go on the internet. It's the age of internet wisdom. All you have to do is go to Google and you can find out almost anything, or at least what people want you to believe about a certain topic, right? So knowledge is everywhere. Knowledge can be picked up by anybody. But to be truly wise or to have wisdom means that you act on a certain set of knowledge. And that's very important when it comes to the Hebrew Testament, to understanding Torah, and to understanding the teachings of Mar Yeshua, the Master Jesus. For them, knowledge wasn't enough. You can know every verse in the Bible. You could have read the Bible front, backwards, inside out, outside in. You can probably quote a lot of verses that are beneficial to your point of view for so many reasons. But the fact is that knowledge is not wisdom. Wisdom is when we actually do the teachings of Torah, when we actually do the teachings of Mar Yeshua. It's not enough to just be a hearer, but you have to be a doer. And it's that doing that sanctifies the soul, that illumines the mind, that illumines consciousness, that allows us to purify ourselves in such a way that we can have a deeper, more profound union with God consciousness. So knowledge is just knowing something. I can know how to make brownies, but unless I actually make the brownies, am I going to enjoy the taste in my mouth of a brownie? Am I going to love the chocolatey flavor, the moist texture of the brownie? No. So knowing how to make something isn't the same as actually making it and enjoying it. And it's the same thing on the spiritual path. So many people hop from church to church, or from religion to religion, or from spiritual sect to spiritual sect. And you can accumulate a lot of knowledge in this way. But to become truly wise, you have to settle into a tradition, and you have to actually do the teaching and experience how that transforms your consciousness, how that transforms the way you act in the world, how that transforms your heart. That is what true wisdom is. Something that transforms you, that makes you a better human, that makes you a better part of the whole, that you somehow contribute to the evolution of all of creation, all that is emanated. So here in the very last sentence, he said, for in much wisdom is much vexation. If you dabble in many spiritual paths, you'll see eventually that they all contradict each other. And that can be very frustrating when you're really passionate about something you're reading about, this particular spiritual path. And then you read about this one and they contradict each other. And then you feel like you're back at square one with trying to understand the universe and your relationship with whatever it is that has made us or that we have come from. So if you have too much spiritual wisdom and you're trying to process many different spiritual practices, that can create a lot of frustration. And usually the frustration is that you do not move forward in any of those areas that you are exploring. So it's good to shop around in the beginning, but then once you find what you're looking for, it's good to sink into one or two practices that will really help you to go deep and help you to illuminate your consciousness. And those who increase knowledge increase sorrow. You know, if you're just reading books, you're not going to be happier from it. You might feel inspired, but if you don't do something about it, then nothing is going to change. You're just going to be a person with more words in your mind. So my martial arts teacher always says, you can know the name of the technique. You can know that you do step 1, 2, and 3, but can you actually do it? If you can't actually do something, then it's useless knowledge. And that truth is accurate in spiritual paths too. There are only 24 hours in a day, and all the great spiritual traditions are beautiful. All of them are beautiful. Research them, look into them, practice a few different spiritual practices, but once you find what works for you, stick with one practice, maybe two. Maybe have a main practice and a supplemental practice. But if you're going to keep on window shopping every spiritual tradition and every guru and every thing that's out there, you're going to dig a lot of holes but never get to water, as they say. So whether it's spiritual or worldly wisdom, it's not going to produce anything, because ultimately meditation isn't what illuminates the mind. Meditation prepares the mind to receive illumination. There's a difference. So if you're always engaging in many different spiritual practices, hoping that enlightenment will come quicker or whatever else, it's not going to get you anywhere, because you're only going to be activating the mind more and more. We don't want to have an active mind during meditation. We want to have a receptive mind, a mind that is receptive to spiritual truth, that is receptive to God as you perceive that to be. So meditation is to prepare the mind to receive illumination. It's a state of open receptivity, which implies pure love and trust in divinity. And once that door is open through a technique of meditation and prayer and aspiration, then eventually that meditative technique just drops away and you experience your oneness. Everything, including the Hebrew Testament, including the New Testament, including every scripture that was ever written, they're only roadmaps. They're words. They're meant to inspire us, but you have to drop them, because the intellect will never experience union with God. My great master said that the intellect is just a pair of scissors that cuts everything apart, that divides. Spiritual illumination is a state of union with divine consciousness. There's no divisions in it. So the intellect and scriptures can only take us so far. But if we're truly seeking God realization, as was the writer of Ecclesiastes, then eventually you have to drop all forms of wisdom and knowledge and just be in a receptive space. And of course, that does not mean that you shouldn't be studying scripture, that you shouldn't be examining your mind and seeing what religious paths benefit you or don't benefit you. But the idea that constantly chasing after wisdom and knowledge, it'll never take you to the goal. You have to settle in something that inspires you and then do it. And let that lead you to a state of open spaciousness that allows God to come into your heart and awaken you and illumine you. And that is the true resurrection. It's a resurrection from spiritual ignorance to spiritual awakening. It's a rising up from mere attachment and aversion to the material reality to rising above material creation and discovering higher spiritual spheres and higher spiritual levels of consciousness. But you have to be patient. You have to sink into one practice until you get there. If you're constantly running after wisdom and knowledge everywhere, it's like chasing after the wind, as the writer of Ecclesiastes writes. And that's just madness and folly, because you'll never get to your goal. That is my interpretation of Ecclesiastes 1:16-18. Next, we get into another phase. Other people deal with, some people want to transcend suffering and worldly existence by exploring both worldly and spiritual knowledge, as we just discussed. But ultimately, the intellect won't give us that union with God that we seek, either consciously or unconsciously or even subconsciously. Another avenue that people choose for attempting to end their suffering or their existential crises that they may have is to numb themselves out with pleasure, drinking, drugs, sex, food, in uncontrolled amounts. So, or in little amounts. Some people fast too much, hoping to enjoy the pleasure of the soul. But I don't think most people define fasting as pleasure. So in Ecclesiastes 2, verses 1-2 and 10-11, I take the parts that are most pertinent. I said to myself, come now, I will make a test of pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But again, this also was vanity. This was illusion, illusory. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil. And this was my reward for all of my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had spent in doing it. And again, all was vanity, illusory, impermanent, and a chasing after the wind. And there was nothing to be gained under the sun. So he's actually describing two things: trying to find pleasure in the world. And there's a lot of pleasure in the world. I don't agree that the world is meaningless, as we've discussed in prior classes on Ecclesiastes. One way that people translate havel, which is translated as vanity here on the screen, other people will translate it as meaningless. You know, pleasure is meaningless. Well, quite honestly, if you're not having fun, then you're not living life. I am not an ascetic in the sense of saying that we should not enjoy the food we eat, enjoy the drinks we have, enjoy the friends and family and love that we have in our life. Of course, pleasure has meaning. But whenever you seek only pleasures to avoid suffering or to avoid understanding spiritual realities, we all come to the same end, don't we? Which one of us haven't experienced death in our life? Are our great-great-great-grandparents still here? We know that life will come to an end. If we're only seeking pleasure in the world, which is evident from Ecclesiastes, verses 3-9 describe how he went into drinking binges and how he ate and how he had slaves that brought him every comfort. You know, he was describing all the different kinds of pleasures that you can lose yourself in the time that this book was written. So in the end, he said he came to a conclusion. First, he said, I will make a test of pleasure to see if that can get rid of suffering or my existential crises or the different kinds of depression and sadness and numbness that we experience throughout our lives. And he said of laughter, it's madness because it doesn't solve the questions of life. Only in silence and meditation are the questions of life truly answered. And of all the pleasures, the worldly pleasures, what use is it? Because every pleasure, though they can be very meaningful, is impermanent. It gives an illusory sense of safeness, an illusory sense of happiness until one day that pleasure, that person, place, or thing goes away, breaks, dies, leaves you. I don't mean to sound depressing or morbid, as I've said in other classes, but the very fact is that every pleasure in the world, no matter how you define pleasure, it's impermanent. Either it will go away or you will die and you can't take it with you. So many people will try and bury themselves in pleasure and drinking or drugs or sex or whatever to try and forget the reality of the world. Seeking God is not easy, right? I'm certain that if people are watching this, that they are true spiritual seekers that have probably been seeking for a long time. And if you haven't been seeking for a long time, then you have very good spiritual karma to be coming and hearing these things. But usually something that happens with many spiritual seekers on many different religious or spiritual paths is that they seek God and then they become frustrated. They become frustrated because they don't become enlightened right away. The different kinds of pain that they're trying to transcend on the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual levels, it doesn't disappear overnight. You have to really work. And that could be really depressing for some people or an eye opener because so many people out there on the internet, I saw something on Facebook the other day about this guy that promises super conscious meditation by just reading 30 words. And if you pay this much money, you'll have these 30 words. And guess what? That doesn't exist. Everybody has to start on the first step and work their way up to union with God. There are no shortcuts. We each have to do the work. And once people realize it's work, they're like, oh, well, let's see how just diving into the pleasures of the world works. And then eventually all those pleasures fail you and you realize that you have to start where you left off in the spiritual path. So the writer of Ecclesiastes said that whatever I desired, I just got. Whatever I wanted, I did. Whatever pleasure I wanted to experience, I had. But none of it gave me true lasting happiness. It was all like chasing after the wind. There's nothing of real value to be gained under the sun. And it's not that things are meaningless. Again, everything has value. Our families have infinite value. Our friendships, our spiritual friendships, like here, everything should be seen as a gift from God, and it has deep meaning on our spiritual paths. But when the writer of Ecclesiastes says that there's nothing to be gained under the sun, he or she is stating that everything is impermanent. If you want lasting happiness, if you want lasting pleasure, that can only be sought in God. And I would agree with the writer of Ecclesiastes. But what about a middle path, right? Sometimes Ecclesiastes can be written in such a way that it's depressing, that it makes you feel like, oh God, do I even want to try this? Do I want to live in the world? Do I want to try the spiritual path? Quite simply, just prioritize God and then seek the middle path. It's not that you can't have a glass of beer for God's sake. Some people say Jesus turned, the water was turned into grape juice. No, it said he turned it into wine. So, we shouldn't be silly. We shouldn't be extreme. But what we should do is put God first. And we should embody the teachings of whatever we say that we're following. whatever spiritual path we're following, whether it be this one or something else. So we should prioritize God, and then we should enjoy what God gives us. Why should we not enjoy our friends, enjoy our children, enjoy our car, enjoy whatever it is that we enjoy? As long as it's wholesome and doesn't hurt anybody, why not enjoy the gifts that God gave us? But we should understand that everything, every person, place, thing, anything that we could attain for, any desire that we could want, that we do attain, it is on loan from God. And realize that at some point you're going to have to give it back through one manner or another. Enjoy what God gives you, but know that the only permanent joy, the only permanent refuge from any kind of suffering, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, is God alone. So seek God, and all things will be added unto you. Seek the greater, ask for the greater thing, and the lesser things will come. The greater thing being God and God's sovereignty. And our final verses for the day: wisdom excels folly. Ecclesiastes 2:13-15. Then I saw that wisdom excels folly, as light excels darkness. The wise have eyes in their head, but fools walk in darkness. Yet I perceived that the same fate befalls all of them. Then I said to myself, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said to myself that this is also vanity, illusory. There are different stages in spiritual growth. There's the honeymoon period where you hear a spiritual truth or you meet a spiritual teacher that excites you and you're like, yeah, I want to do this. This is cool. Awesome. And then there's a period where you start doing the practices, and maybe those practices are exciting, that meditation technique or that style of praying or that way of thinking. It stimulates you and it turns you on and you want to do it. But then after doing it for months or years, you're like, oh, this is getting boring. And how much have I changed? Am I illumined yet? I'm still suffering. I still have problems. I still have ups and downs. Every spiritual path requires some kind of sacrifice. It could be a mere sacrifice of time, or it could be more profound sacrifices. And I don't want to get off on a tangent too much on that today, but every path, when you look at it, requires a sacrifice. At minimum, a sacrifice of your time to study, to meditate, to pray, to hopefully serve those that are less fortunate than you, those that are vulnerable in our communities. And there's a certain point when we plateau, or our spiritual growth or our spiritual understanding plateaus, and we realize that we've not achieved perfection or illumination yet. And at that point, usually people wonder, well, I've given up these things to do this, and I'm still not progressing. Should I continue? And some people will go on a hiatus and not do spiritual practices and come back after some length of time, or they don't come back at all. Earlier, the writer of Ecclesiastes said that all wisdom, all intellectual wisdom will fail you. You have to go beyond it. You have to go into intuitive, receptive experience. But he's even saying here that wisdom excels folly. So intellectual, spiritual thinking, high spiritual thinking and simple living is better than just merely stumbling around in the material world, drinking and doing stupid stuff that wastes our time and our money and our life energy, for that matter. But it's just the same as light excels darkness. But still, it's not really a happy statement that he's saying. He's saying the wise have eyes in their head, meaning they see through their consciousness. But fools walk in darkness. All they see is the material realm. Whereas the wise have eyes in their head and they can see through spiritual consciousness higher realities. He said, what happens to the fool will also happen to me. Why then have I been so very wise? What do we think he's talking about here? He's talking about death. Whether we're smart, wise, have a lot of spiritual wisdom, or whether we're a fool, we're spiritually ignorant, we all will meet the end of this mortal frame someday. So if everybody's going to die, then why have I been so wise? Why shouldn't I just enjoy the world? These are things people think about as they progress the spiritual path. And believe it or not, to even think about the options like this is a kind of spiritual growth, because many people don't even come to this inner struggle, this dark night of the soul. Many people will never even ask themselves this question because many people won't even approach the spiritual path in earnest. Most people are just happy with believing in something that will just magically save me. They're not interested in doing something. I just want to believe in something that will save me whenever I have my last breath. There are very few people that do. And those that do realize that there's some work to be done. There's quite a lot of work to be done. And once you get so far along the path and you've experienced so many years of not growing as quickly as you'd like, people will start to ask questions about, well, wouldn't it have been better, since I'm not gaining high spiritual states of consciousness, wouldn't it be better to just be like everybody else? And the answer is, once you sincerely step your foot to the spiritual path, you can't turn back. Once you really seek union with God, the world is a little bit gray and you can't go back to it. And that's what Jesus meant whenever he said, those that put their hand to the plow and turn away aren't fit. Keep on going forward. And I don't think that that's meant to be taken fatalistically. We talked about this verse at some other point. But it is a strong point that once you put your hand to the plow and you want to experience the harvest of union with God consciousness, those that turn away and quit, are they really deserving of God consciousness in that lifetime? It's okay to rest, but don't quit. It's okay to reevaluate, but don't quit. Keep taking small steps forward, even if they're small. And of course, even if there's a hard break, we can always choose to come back to the path. And so many people do that. This is the meaning of these verses. Let us conclude with the second cup of blessing. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother of the universe, help me to deeply appreciate all the gifts you've given me in my life, my education, my friends, this church, the food you put in my mouth every day. But help me realize that all the material things that can be given, they're impermanent. Yes, I will enjoy them as gifts from you, but I will know that the only thing that can ever fulfill me is you and union with you. May I realize that all is impermanent, including this body. So may I always seek the greater, and all the little things will be added unto us. Amen. 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 Good Shabbat, everybody. I will see you next Friday. Have a beautiful weekend.